Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today we want to talk about sustainability and stewardship, because as the dominant species we have to ask ourselves, should we live sustainably? Do we have a responsibility for that? And do we also have a responsibility to be good stewards of the environment? And as of yet, we have not really done a very good job at either of those things. But I want to remind you that when you have a good, solid ecosystem that is productive, it is helpful for humans too, because remember, natural resources are things that we use, like materials and energy, right? And most of the time they're essential, actually. And then services are going to be the functions of nature, like the purification of water that we've talked about in the past, that's also going to support us and our economy. And so natural capital is just as much an asset as any other thing that you could have, say, in business. Or in your life in general, actually. So when we talk about ecosystem capital, the goods and services, remember that we had this whole list before, but you can divide those into four categories. There are the provisioning goods and services, and those are going to be the things, goods, provided by the ecosystem, so food, water, etc. The regulating capital, and that's going to be the benefits from the actual processes of the ecosystem itself. The supporting, right, those are going to be the services that maintain conditions. So like we can have good agriculture because soil, right, the biogeochemical cycles. We can grow crops because there are pollinators, right, things like that. And then the cultural, these are going to be those abstract benefits, the recreational, the aesthetic, the spiritual, whatever, educational too, actually. But all of those things that are about us specifically and our relationships with nature and our relationships with each other. All right, now, when you look at the principles of sustainability, there are really four things that we focus on. The first one is that we are relying on solar energy, and that can mean a lot of things, whether you're talking about the food web or you're talking about, photovoltaic cells, which we'll talk about later because there are pros and cons to those. But it's going to be stuff like that. And then biodiversity, we need a good, complex web, right? We need species richness, species diversity, okay? And then also nutrient cycle. We need to make sure that the ecosystem is healthy enough to do all of that recycling that it does, and there needs to be population control, and frankly, that probably includes us as well. And so, since we're the fastest growing and largest of the mammals group. Okay, now, when you have degradation, this causes real problems, right? And so all of these things are things that we've either talked about or we are going to talk about. But these are the big issues in the degradation of natural capital. And I'm going to let you, of course, read that slide. I'm not going to read it to you. But our next question is, there are three critical factors that have combined to accelerate the ecological crisis facing both the economy and sustainable development, actually. And they are what? Political uncertainty, birth rate decline and economic stabilization, population growth, world poverty, and rapid industrialization of the developing nations, population growth, political uncertainty, and world poverty, or rapid industrialization, political uncertainty, and birth rate decline. Well, first of all, I just want to point out the birth rate decline is actually a positive thing. Economic stabilization would also be a positive thing. So anything with that in it is right out, okay? Industrialization of developing nations is good. It's got some bad things that go with it in terms of pollution and resource usage, but overall it's not a bad thing because you can develop sustainably if those countries are willing to, right? But population growth, political uncertainty, and poverty are all huge obstacles that stand in the way of sustainability. So when we look at the global environmental picture, this rapid human population growth, right, is tied to an increasing consumption as quality of life goes up with industrialization. And again, we'll talk about that later on. All of this leads to the decline of ecosystems, right? And our usage of fossil fuels has changed the atmosphere, the climate, right? And of course, we're losing biodiversity right and left because of a lot of our choices that we're making. So, right, when we put that all together, you end up having really five big problems. One, population growth, which I can't say enough about. Unsustainable resource use. Consumption, just consumption, consumption, consumption. Poverty is a real problem, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about the human population. We don't consider environmental costs, And we try to manage nature when we don't really know enough about it, or at least the people who are managing nature are not the people who know about it. So let's start with consumption. When we look at consumption, we are a very consumptive species, right? And that is actually true regardless of where you are or who you are. Most of the time, like what culture I mean, individuals have individual things. But overall, it is human nature to want to have more things if we can get more things. And in the developed world, that's been known as conspicuous consumption, when you want everybody to know that you can buy all of these things. But ultimately, we want stuff. And if you look, even in the subsistence farmers, right, they don't have a lot of stuff. But, you know, the question becomes, if they had more money and more available things, would they have more things? And the answer is probably yes. Okay, so resource consumption is going to vary, but it tends to be much higher in developing nations because it can. Wow, that should say developed nations, not developing. Developed. I'll fix it on your PowerPoint. So they're much higher in developed nations. Ha, just kidding. I fixed it now. Anyway, higher in developed nations. Okay. So, when you're consuming, when you're using all of these things, there's a certain ecological footprint that you have, right? And that is something that we are going to calculate for each of you later this year. But basically, when you have an ecological footprint that is larger than the biological capacity, that's an ecological deficit, and that is a huge problem. And ecological footprints as a whole are growing. Cultural changes have actually increased our consumption as well. The agricultural revolution, right, allowed us to be settled and to start specializing in jobs and having an economy and things like that. Then we have the industrial medical revolution, where we start having lots of technology, right? We start having machines to make our lives easier. We can make products faster and cheaper. And then in the information globalization revolution, right, we are now sharing. The world is very, very small, and it didn't used to be, right? And so we have lots and lots of ways to exchange information and goods that we didn't have before. And all of these changes are associated with greater energy use, greater resource use, and more pollution, which leads to environmental degradation. Damage to the ecosystem in one part of the world often stabilizes the system of natural selection, affects people in other locations, increases both the population and rate of industrialization, or reduces the demand for fossil fuels and fresh water. Well, remember I said that it's a small world, right, nowadays? And so when you have damage in one place, just like it affects other species, it's going to affect people, because we are a species and part of the system. So it's going to be problematic. So if, let's say, China has lots and lots of air pollution, that is going to follow the air currents over to the west coast of the United States. And no matter how much money those states put into cleaning up the air, as long as China does not have strict environmental regulations about that, then the west coast will always have air pollution. Now, energy, lighting the night. When you look at this, you can see massive amounts of energy being used just in electricity alone, just in lights. Yeah? And of course, we pave over everything, so we have these big cities, all of this concrete, and these are all things that we've either talked about or we're going to talk about in the coming units. And so what really starts to happen is you have something called the tragedy of the commons. And common property, and places that are open, that have open access, you have the degradation of the environment and the resources. And this is a problem. And in 1968, Garrett Hardin actually named this the tragedy of the commons. And because you have these common spaces that everyone is using and no one feels responsible for, okay, then we start having problems with keeping them clean and viable. And air, my air example was a really good one because the atmosphere is a common. Open ocean fisheries, when you're out in international waters, right, you can fish however you want, pretty much. And that is how overfishing happens, stuff like this. And so common spaces need to be, someone needs to take responsibility for them. And it's a really good question about who and how, and that's something we'll talk about later on. But which of the followings is not true about the commons, right? Maximizing advantages for society as a whole leads to destruction of the commons. It is a shared resource that a group of people uses collectively. Voluntary mutual restraint can preserve the commons. All users, both present and future, lose if the commons is destroyed. Well, I think the last one is pretty obvious. Yeah. The second choice is the definition of a commons. And then three, well, if everybody takes care of it, if everybody practices sustainability and stewardship of the commons, then they will be better, right? And so that's true. But when you maximize advantages for society, that doesn't necessarily lead to a destruction of the commons. When you start working together as a community, right, and you maximize your abilities to take care of this, so you are capitalizing on the advantages of the commons, but you're not degrading it, then it won't be destroyed. So, one. So, why do we have environmental problems? Well, we've talked about that. And those were the 5 things that I listed. But here's the catch: people with different environmental worldviews don't always feel the same about environmental problems and what we should do about them. And global climate change is a really good example. It is happening, right? But there's a lot of disagreement. Well, there used to be disagreement as to whether it was happening or not, and still some people feel that it's not. But it is. But there's disagreement as to what's causing it. Some people think it's a natural cycle. Some people think it's deforestation, although deforestation does contribute. The largest cause of global climate change is going to be the burning of fossil fuels, right? And so deforestation contributes because we lose that carbon sink, but lots of people feel different about how that works. And so there's 2 things that go on here. One, people don't really understand science and evidence, right? So the fact that it is happening is really not debatable. But what to do about it is debatable. There are people who don't care and don't want to do anything about it. There are people who want us all to live in, animal skin tents and have fires and no electricity. That is also probably not a good idea and not particularly comfortable. So there's a wide range in between those 2 extremes of things that we can do. And you'll need to decide on your own what you think is the best solution to all of these issues. Okay? But one big problem when we start talking about natural capital is that it is not valued, right? Companies, when they start looking at costs of things, when they start projecting out, there's not an inclusion a lot of times for the environmental cost. Now, is that true for all companies? No. But historically, it's been true for the majority of companies, although that is changing, right? Goods and services really don't involve the harmful environmental costs. When you buy a battery, the fact that all of those things have to be landfilled, and they shouldn't be landfilled, they should be disposed of securely because they're hazardous waste, but they end up being landfilled, and that causes problems. That's not in the cost of the battery itself. Okay? And then lots of companies receive tax breaks and subsidies, which is a good thing because it helps create jobs and stimulate the economy, right? But sometimes those tax breaks don't include the environmental things, and while the economy may be stimulated, it may lead to a degradation of natural capital if those tax breaks and subsidies aren't applied in the right way, taking into account the environmental cost. Now, organizations that are ecologically sustainable will make and transport products using the maximum amount of energy, design products that only last for a short period of time, not use up natural resources any faster than they can be replenished or substitutes be found, all of these or none of these. Well, you probably wouldn't want to use the maximum amount of energy possible because that's wasteful. You don't want short lifespans of products because now you're constantly making new ones and using resources. But you probably do want to use resources at a sustainable rate. You don't want to use them faster than they're replenished, or you could find a substitute that is sustainable, either one of those things. So 3 is the answer. Okay. Now, but let's get back to that worldview thing, though. There are different environmental worldviews. And when it comes to environmental problems, really you've got kind of 3 big things, right, in terms of environmental management. So there's planetary management, okay, and this is kind of like a cornucopia view. We will always save ourselves. We're never going to run out of resources because of, sorry about that. We're never going to run out of resources because we are smart, right, and we are very good at coming up with new things. Stewardship is that we have this ethical responsibility that we probably wouldn't run out of resources, but we still shouldn't waste them, and we should encourage environmentally beneficial forms of growth, and then our success is going to depend on how well we manage those systems, right? Whereas in the planetary management view, it's going to, depend on how we manage those systems for our benefit, okay? Whereas in stewardship, we're trying to take care of the rest of nature too. And then there's the environmental wisdom, and I don't actually know who names these. They're whatever. But this is that we're part of nature. We are really incorporated in the system, and that resources are limited and should not be wasted, that we need to encourage earth-sustaining forms of economic growth, and our success depends on learning how nature sustains itself and being a part of that. These are all slightly different. Some of them are very different, and you can decide where you fall in these. Probably like everything else, it's a little bit of moderation. There are points in each of these that you might find useful or helpful or true, and everything is not just one-dimensional. So anyway, think about what you think about that. So what about the future? Can there be a sustainability revolution that's like all of these other revolutions that we've had? Well, living sustainably means living off of natural income, right? So we need to really focus on renewable resources instead of non-renewable resources. And the 2005 Millennium Ecosystems Report, which was actually a 4-year study, says that well over half of our natural systems and services are degraded or overused, and that could be a real problem. So at some point we need to start thinking about this. What is natural income? What does it mean? And how can we balance the quality of life we want to have with the way we need to manage the environment? And so an environmentally sustainable society is one that meets the current and future basic resource need without compromising the ability of the systems to meet future generations' needs. Okay? And societies can become more environmentally sustainable. One of the things about economic development is if it's directed towards sustainability, it can be very, very successful because you have the resources to protect the environment, and that's a good thing, okay? And here are just some solutions, right? Our current emphasis is on kind of mitigating things or not doing anything at all. But if we were to shift to a sustainability emphasis, we would be looking at prevention, protection, and restoration, okay? Now, one of the things that comes up is what's called a design for disassembly, because products, we're going to use products. So design for disassembly is an approach to improving environmental performance of products because the products are disassembled and disposed of at the end of their useful life, disassembled when not being used during their normal useful life, disassembled and recycled at the end of their useful life, or accessories are disassembled and repaired during their useful life. Well, you take them apart and recycle, and then you can put them in new products, and that seems kind of obvious. So number 3, okay? Now, focus on sustainability. I've put this chart in here. This has come up over and over and over again in this PowerPoint, so you want to know these, okay? And then, of course, environmental regulations. The government cannot be responsible, and ultimately the government cannot really, the job of the government is not to step in and regulate people's lives. However, right, and by the way, the free market actually really does force companies to do things that people want. So if people want sustainable products, then companies who want to be successful will do sustainable products with or without governmental regulations, because that's how they make money, right? So the benefits of environmental regulations from the government, though, do include that emissions of nearly all pollutants have dropped since 1990. Improved air and water quality is a thing that is increasing, and the growth of some industries has been really based on environmental products and services, which is really great. So all of these have happened because there does need to be some regulation, right? Regulatory oversight of some things, not everything. Okay, so here are 4 regulations that you want to know about. The Wilderness Act of 1964, okay, and so this is going to preserve wild areas. The Migratory Bird Act protects birds that are migrating across the landscape. Sustainable Fishery Act, this is going to prevent overfishing. And the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which protects all of the cetaceans, the whales, the dolphins, right, all of those, the seals, all of those guys. And so you want to read that. All right, that's it for this one. If you have any questions, please ask me at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time.